Hello, welcome back to Introduction to Sociology with Dr. John. And in today's lecture, we're going to be talking about gender inequality. Now, what is gender and how is it determined? So one common confusion is the confusion between sex and gender, and even sexual identity and gender identity. Sex is the biological determination of, for example, male and female. Basically, according to genitalia, there are hormonal differences. Women obviously are the half of the species that is able to directly reproduce. Males are the half of the species that are not able to reproduce. So this is determined by nature, generally the specific combination of chromosomes that you inherit from your parents. Gender, however, is a social construct. Gender is the expectations that we have of people who we consider to be male or female. So gender may vary substantially between different cultures, even within the same culture, in terms of how people believe that women and men should act. It can change over time, for example. So gender is based not on nature, but on nurture. Gender and biology, well, of course, as we said, there are physical differences between men and women, but behavioral differences, it's much less clear how these are related to biological differences. For example, in 1974, a study by Maccabee and Jacqueline claimed there were 4 basic differences between boys and girls. For example, boys were better at math, women are better at English, boys are better at this, sports, women are better at that. But over time, these differences have diminished or disappeared in some cases. The point is, the differences existed primarily because of social reasons. Women were not supposed to do well at math, and so were discouraged, so they would give up. Men were supposed to do well at sports, so many men would try to prove themselves as men, boys, for example, by excelling at sports. Now, another study by Udry looked at prenatal exposure to testosterone and how that affects maybe the development of some behavioral characteristics in the brain. So, for example, perhaps male testosterone makes men more aggressive, and female hormones make them less aggressive. So it's possible in this way that there is some relationship, but generally speaking, these differences are not massive, and the testosterone levels between men and women are not necessarily a great indicator of behavior. How is gender determined? So once we're born in a culture, that culture will say, you're a boy, you're a girl, and basically assign you from birth that characteristic. And you will be expected to follow the norms of behavior according to that characteristic. So even from birth, parents will have a boy and people will say, oh, he's so strong, he's so virile, he's going to be big. And when they're shown a girl, even it's the same baby, but they just told it's a boy or a girl, with a girl, they'll be, oh, she's so beautiful, she's so calm, she's so sweet, how nice she is. Of course, then there are the different toys. Boys are given warlike toys or construction toys. Women are given dolls and things that they're supposed to nurture, like a baby. And again, these are not present in a baby itself. Babies don't have any natural nurturing or construction tendencies. These are imposed on them, and they're expected to perform. So these are what we call gender roles. Gender identities are the way we think of ourselves as a boy, as a girl, and this occurs through social interaction. Gender roles are applied to us, how we're supposed to dress, how we're supposed to speak, how we're supposed to walk even, employment opportunities. All of these will be based on what sex you are. And so gender is one of those statuses that tends to serve as a master status, because it will influence almost everything else that will happen in your life. Even if you violate gender expectations, and then you have the issue, for example, of homosexuality, people who believe they are not their natural sex but the opposite sex, or people who believe that they prefer, even if they're not homosexual, they may prefer the gender roles of the opposite sex. So, for example, tomboys, girls who like to play and they like to play army, they don't want to be like girls. So we have a lot of variation, and the point is, yes, variation exists with regard to every social expectation, but typically there are negative aspects when you violate those social expectations. There's some debate as to, in recent generations or the last generation or so, because of the women's movement, have there been changes in the way that boys and girls are socialized? Well, I mean, frankly, there was a lot of discussion about this in the 1980s, 1990s, but largely today it seems that a lot of ways gender expectations have kind of gone back to how they were in the 1960s, 1970s. So gender is defined by culture. Therefore, gender roles will vary across different cultures, and they will vary across time within the same culture. So, for example, in some cultures, such as the Arapash, these are tribes in Brazil, Tasmanians, which are tribes in Africa, and a number of different tribes in Africa also. Women actually take on more of the outside roles. They do many of the harder tasks. They're in charge of agriculture, for example. Some do many of the heavy labor associated with agriculture, and some other very dangerous tasks. So women have a lot more power and respect in these societies relative to men. So it's not true that necessarily women are always the weaker sex. In the United States, over time, as with other cultures, we see differences over time. Hair lengths. It used to be women had to have long hair, boys had to have short hair. Those have changed. Those norms have changed. 500 years ago, all the men had long hair. I don't know about the women, because they wore their hair in hats, so you couldn't see what the length their hair was most of the time. But the point is, these things change. So to assume that these things are natural, or that even behavior expectations associated with gender are natural, is absurd. Now, we know, for example, gender socialization occurs extremely young. As soon as a child is born, it is gender identified, sex identified, and as a result, gender identified. So immediately people will be like, oh, we have to have everything pink because it's a girl. And see, I'm wearing my pink shirt today. It has to be blue because it's a boy. We have to get sports equipment for the boy. We have to get dolls and doll houses for the girls, so the girls can practice house cleaning, get them a little toy oven with a little button light inside to cook miniature food. For what reason, I don't know. Give her a little vacuum cleaner so she can pretend to clean the house. And if it's boys, then give them sports, have them run around outside playing sports. So these things are endless. I mean, and there's no escaping it, because even if parents want to raise their child gender neutral, it's impossible. They're going to be bombarded with images from TV, from the internet, from social media. As soon as they go to school, their peers will be bombarding them with these gender messages. They are constantly reproduced in every single social interaction. There's not a single interaction you will have that will not encompass gender expectations being enforced. So it's going to impact very early from birth, and as the child grows, it will be constantly reinforced. If they don't behave according to gender expectations, they will be censured, right? So just as we talked about with socialization, the socialization to gender is a dramatic and powerful one. So what are some of the inequalities? We'll talk quite a bit about this, but obviously sexism is one thing. So like racism, which we talked about before, remember racism is not an issue about race, because race doesn't exist in that way. But it's the belief that race exists and determines or should determine behavior. Sexism is the same. It's the belief that because of your sex, which is a biological fact, but that this success is going to determine or should determine your behavior, that you are biologically suited for a specific role, and also that this explains the inequality in society. So we'd say, well, it isn't that women are oppressed, they're just women. That's the way they are. God punishes them in the Bible because of Adam and Eve and blah, blah, blah. So again, just as we talked about racism, the same things can occur. You have individual sexism and you have institutional sexism. And institutional sexism, for example, in the past, of course, there were specific rules. A lot of these rules are now more hidden. So, for example, women are allowed into college. They're allowed to have their own bank accounts now. They're allowed to have, they're allowed to vote, and all of these other things. So you might say, well, there's no more sexism. There are no laws that prescribe women from doing things. But yet there may be inferred sexism in the specific rules. For example, a fire department might have height, weight, lifting requirements that are not suitable for women, that give preferential treatment to men, or they give preferential treatment to more male attitudes about things as opposed to female attitudes about things. So in these senses, they're going to select out women and select in men. And we see this very often in high profile or high status or high income jobs, where surprisingly, or rather not surprisingly, you find very few women. Women are much more prevalent in the lower status jobs. And when women start to take over a job, like more women become doctors, it's often because the status of the profession itself is going down. So this is why women are considered a minority. As we said before, minority is not determined by numbers but power. So women are actually a slight majority in almost every society, but in almost every society, they have less power as individuals and as a group. So, we're not saying this is on all cases. Of course, there are examples of powerful women, prime ministers, ministers, women who run companies, and in fact, even way back when, right, you had Queen Elizabeth I, a very powerful queen, Queen Boadicea. You've always had some examples of women in power, and in many cases they did quite well. But the point is, these were exceptions to the norm. They only occurred under very, very extraneous circumstances, when for political reasons or for some other reason, it was better to grab the woman than grab a man who maybe everybody didn't want. So these are the circumstances when women get into power. It's because men put them there or prefer to have them there as opposed to some other man they don't like. So we won't go into all of that history, but this is the point. Historically, women encounter more discrimination, more prejudice, and as a result, women as a whole have become a self-conscious social group. Even as far back as the 17th century, during the English Civil War, there was a very powerful women's movement for a while that argued for the right to vote and the right to equality in all matters with men, but they didn't get very far at that time, I should say. So where does gender identity come from? So I'm going to briefly go over these different theories of gender identity because they're basically the same as the socialization theories we discussed earlier, only applied to gender. So for example, Freud, remember, talked about the Oedipal complex, and it primarily applies to men. Some men identify themselves. First, men want to be with their mothers, but because of the father figure, they fear that, so they identify with the father figure and repress their individual urges in order to become a man. So they model themselves on the father. And this, of course, this is a very Victorian, old theory. It doesn't really carry much water, but it may have some truth to it. But certainly at that time, the ideal man was one who separated from women, had very little to do with women in any social context. The only woman would be the wife, and that would be in the home, or maybe other times they would have other women, but that was considered allowable. In any case, there was a similar argument for women called the Electra complex. Again, the idea is that women end up identifying with the mother and taking over the mother's identity. Cultural transmission theory, so if you remember that theory, basically is the argument that children learn from behavior around them, that there's this control theory is related to it, punishment and reinforcement of the norms. So boys and girls will learn the cultural norms of how to behave according to their gender. Cognitive development theory, remember, also talks about how children go through specific stages. So at each stage, boys and girls will start to identify in different ways based on trying to seek out gender-appropriate behavior in order to seek the approval of others. So they self-socialize, largely looking at what other people do, trying to imitate them, and trying to learn the lessons from other people. So whereas cultural transmission focuses more on the process of what children are taught, cognitive development is focused more on what children look at and learn for themselves. So children will learn it for themselves, which in a way creates a more powerful process of socialization. Because if you learn something for yourself, you'll probably hold it closer and believe it more firmly. So it's very difficult, therefore, afterwards for men and women to break out of these gender roles and expectations. And associated with that is the concept of self-construals. So in other words, these are ways we think about ourselves, very basic ways of thinking about ourselves. So for example, men are encouraged to think of themselves as independent, as strong. I can handle it. I can do it by myself. I don't need any help, right? So men driving down the street don't know where they're going, but they will never stop to ask somebody because they're embarrassed, right? If they have to stop and ask somebody where the fire station is, that implies they don't know. They're not independent. They need other people, right? Whereas women, even, no matter how strong they might be, women are much more likely to reach out to other people and ask them, and do you know where this is? Do you know where that is? So women are much more likely to do that because they're encouraged to be more interdependent, to be more dependent in a way, but that also implies being interdependent, being more supportive perhaps of others. So whereas men, in a cartoon I saw recently, men will fight over the bill, like, I want to pay the bill, I want to pay the bill, I want to pay the bill. And the guy who ends up paying the bill will be like, darn, I had to pay the bill. Right? But they couldn't admit that they didn't want to pay the bill. Whereas women will be like much more easy to just like, let's divide the bill up so everything's fair, so nobody has bad feelings, and so on and so forth. So one way of thinking about this is using the term patriarchy. Again, we talked about this earlier in section 1 when we talked about society. Patriarchal societies are ones in which men dominate, and typically they dominate through the inheritance system, and we'll talk more about this later on. But patriarchy is a system of social organization that systematically gives men a disproportionate share of power. Perhaps men are the ones that own property, so women are helpless unless they have a man. So therefore they're forced into marriage, maybe even at a very early age. Right? So this system is rooted in culture and legal systems, and we'll discuss it more later. But the point is, if we say patriarchy is just in the past, that's not true. A lot of laws have changed, so women have the right to vote, women have the right to own their own property, and other laws have changed, but yet there are still distinctive disadvantages that women have in the workplace. And even when women have power, as I said before, these powers are often subsidiary to male powers. Women, when they do achieve a position of power, it's because either there's no male present at the time to take it, or they're preferred over some guy that nobody wants. And again, women are expected, and it's the norm for women to put their careers secondary to their husbands, and therefore to earn less, because over time they will lose experience. They will be the ones who move or change jobs. Again, this is not 100% the case nowadays, but it's still the dominant case. For example, when women have a child, that very often involves the woman being out of the workforce for at least a period, maybe years. And again, it's assumed that women are the primary child caregiver in the family. So when a woman says, "Oh, my son is sick, I have to stay home," that's accepted. But if a guy were to call in and say, "Oh, my son is sick, I have to stay home," people are going to be like, "Well, where's your wife? Why doesn't your wife take care of this?" And this goes along with many of the same things that happen with race, again, tokenism, that sometimes women are put in a position just so companies can say, "Look, we have women at the top." So they're selected not for their skills, but just because they're a woman. Glass ceilings, so this means that there's a limit very often to how far women can rise. And again, just because there are exceptions, like Queen Elizabeth I, Queen Boadicea, other queens throughout history, Queen Cleopatra, etc. This does not mean that, oh, there's no more glass ceiling. No, it just means that there was one exception for various reasons. Right? And then another term sometimes uses the term glass escalator, which refers to when a man is in a woman's role. So, for example, a male nurse, they often find that they're promoted very quickly, or a male teacher in an elementary school. Because these jobs are considered female jobs, the men tend to get promoted up and out of them faster because people expect or assume that they deserve more or they're worth more. So they tend to get promoted up, and this is what is called the glass escalator effect. Glass because, of course, you can't see it, but it's an invisible force. So some of the different theories of gender. The functionalist theory of gender, of course, nowadays sounds very outdated, but basically it assumes that there are biological differences between men and women. Of course, labor is divided based on these differences. Since women give birth and women can feed the child, ergo they are better suited to rear the children. Now this is not necessarily true, but again, this is the argument. And the argument, again, also is that families are organized among instrumental and expressive lines. Instrumental means somebody's in charge, they're goal-oriented, they're tool-oriented, instrument. So men are considered more instrumental, more rational, so they all go out and provide economically for the family, or they're the primary breadwinner. Whereas women, they're more emotional, so they serve the more expressive function of the family and take care of the emotional needs of the children and the husband, as well as their comfort, food and things like that, cleaning. So the idea is that these follow more or less the natural differences between men and women, men being more rational, women more emotional. And of course, as I said, this is a very old theory. It's very popular in the 1950s, as you can see in the picture, right? The man standing there with like, I'm the man, look at me. And the woman with the cake, that's always a good thing, comfort food. And all the children, of course, adore the mother because she provides the comfort, and maybe fear the father because he's the stern authoritarian figure, right? Like the mother would always say when the children are doing badly, just wait till your father gets home, right? And the father is expected to come home and beat the kids or do whatever. So, like I said, the biggest critique of this theory is it's based on very biased theories of gender differences being rooted in nature rather than upbringing. So if these differences between men and women, particularly the instrumental or the rational versus emotional, these are just based on upbringing, then there's no reason why we should have men as the breadwinner and women as the caregiver. A man could easily stay home and take care of his own children. Just because he didn't give birth to them doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't have emotional ties to them. And a woman can easily go out and in many cases may be better capable of going out and earning money. Conflict theory derives two main perspectives. We'll talk about feminist conflict theory later. Right now I'm going to talk more about class-based conflict theory. So basically, class-based conflict theory, this is something that Marx and Engels, his co-author, wrote about almost 200 years ago, is they argued that patriarchy was rooted in the property structure. That because property was assigned to men, primarily in agrarian and early industrial societies, women had to be strictly controlled. Women became appendages, even as basically slaves to men, and their sexuality had to be controlled because if a woman's sexuality, by which I mean her who she sleeps with, were questioned, that then questions the inheritance rights of the children. And how can they inherit if they're not legitimate? So legitimacy of children becomes very, very important, requiring that women constantly, their behavior be constantly controlled. So whereas men can run around and do all kinds of things, and it doesn't affect anything. Whereas women, if they go out or they do anything suspect, their entire honor and their chances of having a marriage or their chances of being respected are all gone. So this created a huge difference in the impositions put on men and women. And since women had to be controlled more, therefore it made sense for them to stay inside the house as much as possible or around the house so that their honor or their basically their sexual honor could be maintained and controlled. So here, for example, in this picture, you see here a picture of what they call a chastity belt. Chastity means somebody who has not had sex. So basically it's a belt to make sure women do not have sex. And I won't go into any further description of it than that. So as a result, men have all the access to power. They're the ones who are able to go outside the home and establish a reputation, whether it's through work or whether it's through noble deeds or something else. Women have to stay in the house and therefore most of the time are going to be dependent on men. Men also benefit from the free labor provided by women. As I said, women are basically treated as slaves. They provide labor for their household, but they're never given a salary or an allowance or anything else that would give them any possibility of independence. And men are allowed to focus on their careers, their wealth, establishing their reputation, etc. Now, symbolic interactionism applies a number of interesting ideas, particularly about how the way symbolically we think about gender affects our thinking patterns. So, for example, the use of pronouns. So very often when we refer to a powerful position, we automatically use the pronoun he, if we don't know the actual sex or gender of the person. By the same token, we assume in a monarchy that there's a king, and the king is in charge. Whereas the term queen does not imply the same level of sovereignty or monarchy as king does. Queen is the wife of the king, right? This is a problem for women in power like Queen Elizabeth I, because at the time she constantly had to assert her power to say, I am the queen and king at the same time. And that's one reason she in particular refused to get married, because she didn't want to marry somebody and then they would call him the king and assume he was in charge, right? So later, for example, with Queen Victoria, when she did marry, they never named the king, her husband was not called the king. He was called the Prince Regent, right? His name was Prince Albert, and he never became king because she held the crown, right? So the language is, if you're a king, you're automatically superior to the queen. So in order to subvert that, they couldn't make him king. Same thing today with Queen Elizabeth. Her husband is Prince Philip, not King Philip, Prince Philip. So the queen is in charge, and to denote that, they have to make the husband the prince, not a king, because king would automatically trump the queen. Right? Another example is how we constantly use male euphemisms, typically of sexual objects, to imply power. So, for example, you say, somebody's got balls, right? Well, what balls? You mean tennis balls? No, they're referring to a male sexual appendage, right? Whereas female genitalia typically are seen as a sign of weakness. So, for example, we say that somebody's a pussy, right, implying that they're like a woman. So womanness, again, is automatically associated with weakness. And this then creates a problem when women are strong and powerful, they're seen as something wrong with them, right? So when women are pushy, or if you have a man and a woman, they're equally ambitious, you'd say that the guy, well, he's ambitious, he's driven, whereas a woman, you'd say she's a bitch, right, which is a female term for, derogatory female term for a dog, right? She's mean, she's pushy, right? So the same attitude on the part of men and women are going to be determined differently, because the woman is not being a proper woman. But the man, it's okay for a man to be like that, because that's the norm, or that's the expectation, rather. Right? There are also ways in which, for example, in popular culture, violence towards women may be encouraged. You think about music industry, and many ways in which women are seen as passive or dependent, or very negative ways, whereas men are seen as the heroes, etc., etc. Now, feminist theories of gender obviously coincide with conflict theory. Feminists are arguing that there is, in some sense, an innate conflict between men and women. But the goal of feminists, of course, is to eliminate this conflict by eliminating the power difference between men and women. Their goal is not to, the goal of feminism is not for women to control men. It's simply for there to be equality, for women to have the same rights, to be independent, to be able to do things that men are normally allowed to do. And one way of doing that is to challenge the gender expectations of a patriarchal culture, and do this on the macro level, for example, at the national sphere, for example, in this case, advocating for the right to vote for women. Well, women have the right to vote, but there's still many attitudes, so you have to also look at the micro level, what's happening in everyday life, in the way, for example, women are expected to do the housework. So men work and they come home and then free, but women work and come home and still have to work. So those expectations at the micro level are also affecting the independence of women. And then when women and men, for example, get divorced, what happens to the children? Who is expected to take care of the children? And basically give up their hope for a career, maybe in some cases, or who is very often ends up in the short, right? Men after divorce tend to be better off economically. Women tend to be worse off economically. So these are again our meso level interactions between men and women. So the idea of feminism is to try to challenge these different levels of inequality, bring attention to them and challenge them. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed our lecture. The next lecture will talk more specifically about gender inequality in the United States.